Warning: this is not safe for children. If you are caught listening to this by your parents, it is your fault, not mine. This is sexual content, not safe for children. If you are under 18, get out. Celebrian. Dear God, I don't want to do this. Celebrian stood before the Goblin King, head bowed. Her long silver locks hid her face. Silent tears streamed down dirty checks. God, we have a misspelling right in the first sentence. Nice. The orcs had not mistreated her. Woe to any orc who spoiled the king's pleasure toy. But the hem of her traveling dress was wet and muddied by the long walk through waterlogged tunnels. Her hair was matted, and her arms were muddied, bruised, and cut from many a tumble in the dark. None that mattered compared to the fate that awaited her at the hands of this so-called king. "What is this?" said the Goblin King. The lift of his loincloth, caused by the stiffening of his cock, demonstrated full well that the question was moot. "An elf bitch, Her Highness, brought from the cave at the top of the pass. We snatched her while she slept." "Was she alone?" asked the king. His yellow, watery eyes gazed at his captive. Those eyes displayed a hint of fear of elf warriors, but far more they glowed with lust. Elves would stop at nothing to reclaim a lost woman to the orcs, as well they should, thought the king, contemplating what lay in store for this fine specimen of elfin womanhood. Breaking her to his needs would be exquisite. "No, your highness, but they have not pursued us yet. Guards are posted. We will know if they come." Celebrian could follow their words, for the orcs were a mixed lot of big uruks and little wood goblins, and used the western tongue to communicate. Her heart could not help leap with the reminder that her husband Elrond would come in search of her, and no force of orcs could stay her rescue. She had only to outlast her captors for a little while. The goblin stroked the stubble of his chin with a great clawed hand. He idly picked the nostril of his large pig nose, and twitched his pig ears so that the tufts of hair in the ears twitched. Tusked teeth protrude upward from his underslung jaw. He smiled. He knew what she was thinking, and he knew that, valor or not, it would take great effort for elves to track them through the maze of tunnels. They had not idly brought her through water-filled tunnels. Tracking was near impossible. The elves would come, but not for a long time, and he would likely be gone long before they arrived. But if not, well, some pleasures were worth the risk. "Strip her," he said at last. Celebrian's head jerked up. Her hair fell away from her face, revealing violet eyes under silver eyebrows, a fine small nose, and a tiny, delicate mouth. The Goblin King thought of what that mouth would soon be willing to engulf. With a final pulse, his cock stiffened to its full 1 foot length. The loincloth slipped to the side, revealing his gnarled, twisted grey member. Black moles of varying height and size dotted his 2-inch wide shaft, but the glans was smooth, bulbous, and more than 3 inches across. Pulsing veins snaked across the shaft. Celebrian gasped and dropped her head again. Her hair fell back across her face, but she could not help dart a glance back at the hideous member. Honoring the king's command, the 2 orcs who had brought her from the cave stepped to her side. With movements more deft than seemed possible for such brutes, they slit the sleeves and shoulder of her dress so that it fell to her waist, caught by her girdle. More flicks of their knives, and the girdle and dress fell to her feet. She was now clad in only her soft buckskin boots. Her lithe, supple form swayed under the cruel gaze of the goblin. The king idly stroked the head of his cock. In response, Celebrian trembled in fear and disgust, sending sweet tremors through her firm, apple-sized breasts graced by perfect, delicate lavender nipples. What? Who has purple nipples? Seriously? Okay, on to the story. The king gripped his shaft still harder. His eyes turned from her quivering breast to the soft silver down that was not thick enough to hide her lavender labia. He smiled. "Clean her." Buckets and rags were brought. The 2 orcs gingerly washed their charge, trembling at the touch of Celebrian's smooth skin, yet also in fear that too familiar a touch would enrage their king. They started at her boots, washed the pillars of her thighs, the gentle curves of her hips, and the swell of her belly. They caressed her small, sweet breast with their wash-rags, and finished with a careful wipe of her face. Through it all, Celebrian stood as still as possible. She feared that any further quiver on her part, any further tremble of her breast might rouse the king to action. She had to delay, she had to survive until Elrond arrived. "Clothe her." A garment was brought. They forced one leg up, then the other. Looking down through her dangling hair, she could not tell what they were dressing her in, only that it was black, tiny, and her legs were through 2 straps. The orcs raised the garment up. She had expected coarse orc cloth, but it was smooth, fine silk. The orcs reached her pubes. She felt the cloth bite into her slit and gasped. She could not keep her eyes from darting to the Goblin King. The king's gaze danced from her eyes to her breasts and back. He leered and passed his lumpy tongue over his tusks and across his thick lips. "She likes that," he said with a laugh. Pointing to the orcs holding the garment at her hips, he said, "Fix the wraps on her twat." Celebrian felt rough orc fingers and claws slide along the silk over her pubes. They brushed her labia. She trembled violently at the touch. This time she forced her eyes down, but this only caused her to watch her bouncing breasts, and only reminded her further of the king's pleasure in her torment. The orc separated the cloth into 2 straps and set them on either side of her labia. "Now do the rest," said the king. The 2 orcs continued to work the garment upward. There was little to it, just a pair of straps that passed from shoulder to her pubes, joined by a horizontal band front and back. The orcs left the straps passing on either side of her breast so that they pushed her flesh into a tight mound. The king regarded the elf bitch before him, naked except for the black silk that shaped her breasts and highlighted her labia. To the orc on her left, the king made a twisting motion with his clawed hand. The orc twisted the horizontal band at Celebrian's back, tightening the straps, and fixed it with some sort of clasp. The action drew her breasts together and pushed it against her genitals, so that her labia protruded 1/2 inch. "Excellent," said the king. Celebrian clenched her jaw at the indignity. She forced her mind to visualize her husband coming to rescue her. She had to endure. She could outlast this beast. He could degrade her with this scrap of clothing. He could even force himself on her, but he would not have her soul. The king waved the 2 orcs away. He sat on his throne, running a hand up and down his shaft around the prominent lip of his glans. His cock was so hard that the taut skin of his glans dully reflected the torchlight. Every lump and mole in his shaft stood clearly defined.